Joining. We are going to record this, so if you don't want your face recorded, feel free to turn off your video. All right. Hi again. I'm Sarah Rosenkrantz. I'm the Exhibits and Education Assistant for the IU Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and your host for today. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that IU Ma and IU Bloomington are on the traditional homelands of the Miami, Shawnee, Potawatomi, and Delaware people. If you're not an IU, I would encourage you to do some research and figure out who was traditionally on your own land. And now I would like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. Ellen Sieber is our head curator here at IUMA. She went to Oberlin College for undergrad and studied studio art and American history. Then came to IU for her master's and PhD, where she focused on anthropological archaeology and the prehistory of West Africa. She's been with the museum since 1995 and has had multiple roles. She started as the curator of education and then the curator of ethnographic collections. And now she is our wonderful head curator, and we're so happy she's going to talk to us today. So welcome, Ellen.
Thank you. Do you want me to start?
Yes.
Well, that's a good idea. I will start sharing my screen. Can y'all see this?
Yes. Yep.
I have to move it so I can see it while I'm staring at the screen, and my camera's sort of pointing in the right direction. Let's see.
Oh, and while Ellen is doing that, I forgot to say that this is going to be a short 10-minute talk with a 10-minute Q&A at the end. So feel free to put your questions in the chat and I will read them off at the end.
Yes, please do. We'll have an audience participation thing at the end. But what I want to do today is not even talk about the photographs so much as the story of how they got here to Indiana and the kind of amazing life incidents that went on that resulted in, I think, several close calls where the photographs themselves and and more importantly, the information associated with them could have been lost. So the photos were taken from 1908 to 1921, and they were mainly, the person who took most of the photos was Joseph Dixon, Wanamaker department store in Philadelphia. And he had a job sort of like a museum educator does now, giving lectures to school kids. And he also had the idea of taking photos of Native Americans. He'd had a photography experience working at Kodak a few years previous, so he knew what he was doing. So the timeline here is the creation of the photos. Dixon, and he had assistants help him. And then there was a period in which nothing was happening, but yet the materials were protected. And then we have the entry of Mr. Bernard Batty. And a couple of years later, Mr. Gilbert Abel, who worked for the Wanamaker store. And then a surprise liberation in 1971. And then sort of the modern era began in the 70s with Susan Applegate. So I will go through those now. So Dixon and his helpers. This one photo on the left side illustrates how hard Dixon, at least in one photo, he posed that long. No, he was very hardworking and did a tremendous job of keeping track of who, where, and when he photographed. So unlike some of the photographers of that era, for many of the photos, if not most, we have the names of the participants. it was a group scene, we don't, but most solo portraits, we know who it was, which is pretty remarkable. The photo on the right shows Dixon photographing a Native American couple standing in front of their house. And they are in more or less traditional garb, while off to the left side, you can see kind of an onlooker who's dressed that we in more everyday wear. And you see this a lot in the photos, that there's some where people have been dressed up in their traditional dress on purpose, and others are just there wearing more regular Western clothes. Okay, so he finished all that work from his office in the Wanamaker store in Philadelphia, and he passed away in 1926, and they locked up his office, and there it stayed. As you can see in these old photos of the interior of the store, it was it's a fairly elaborate place. It's certainly a huge building, and so by simply locking the door, they were able to keep the materials for several years until IU stepped in. How did that happen, you wonder? Well, here's where Mr. Bernard Batty comes in. He was a manager of the Benjamin Harrison House in Indianapolis. And the connection between the Wanamaker store in Indiana is that Benjamin Harrison's postmaster general was John Wanamaker. John Wanamaker was the founder of the store. His son, Rodman Wanamaker, did a lot of the work arranging for the photography. So Bernard headed to Philadelphia to look for a particular painting of President Harrison, and he did find that, but he also saw a very magnificent collection of Indian photographs. And the small photo on at the bottom is some of those photographs on display in the San Francisco exposition of 1915. And there's some information later on in the letter that references them having won a prize. Dixon won a prize for them at that exposition. So, oh, I kind of forgot something here. Another moment of drama was that in 1943, it looked like Bernard Batty was going to hand the stuff over to IU, but President Wells had the two anthropologists on campus then. There wasn't a department, but they were hired in preparation for a department. And one was a linguist and one was a physical anthropologist. And they both looked at the photos and said, these are great, we'll take them. But then Mr. Batty wouldn't release them until Wells had luncheon with him in downtown Indianapolis, which was kind of a big prestige moment, and he wasn't going to miss it for anything. So finally, it was in 1945 that the photos showed up at IU. And at that point, they realized how many there were and how wonderful they were at capturing the elaborate costumes and so on of the various people. So they said, why can't we know more about this? So the person at the head of the IU Foundation at the time wrote to the department store and said, do you have any more information about these? And so the manager of that store, Mr. Abel, wrote back almost instantly and said, we've packed all the stuff, we're sending it to you. 22 cartons and 1 crate, paid by them. So the shipping was paid by the store. And so they were clearly at a point where they were thinking, what are we going to do with this stuff? And then the foundation head wrote to them and they said, oh, that's what we'll do with the stuff. And so they were at IU, but it wasn't really clear who owned them. And it is clear if you look at the records from the 40s, but by 1970, those were a little bit lost in the mist of time. But that meant that one of the anthropologists who had originally looked at them had considered them more or less his property, and they were in his office at the time he died. I'm not going to name his name, but it's pretty easy to figure out. And he just was saying, no, they're mine. And so a previous curator, I don't know if I could have done this or not, broke into that office overnight and took them all away and took them to the museum. And we don't know what would have happened if he hadn't done that. And then along comes Susan Applegate, another person who saved the collection. And she saved the information in particular. And it was quite tremendous. She was a graduate student doing a master's in anthropology. And she worked with a couple of the faculty and managed to get an NEH grant for conserving and cataloging the collection. And this is major because, as I was saying, that Dixon and his helpers wrote all kinds of information about the photos that is incredibly valuable to us now. And she took that information that was on decaying photo sleeves that were non-archival, that were falling apart, very fragile. And she had that all put onto 5x7 index cards that summarized everything that she knew about them based on what was on the photo sleeves, plus some other additional sources. So that was very major. And she later on wrote this book about the North American Indians in the Great War. Was one of the parts of the collection that really fascinated when she was here. But she left here and got a PhD elsewhere and ended up teaching at Michigan State. And when she was there, she resumed her work on the World War I materials. And she unfortunately passed away several years ago, and there's now a scholarship at Michigan State that's named in her honor for Native American Studies. Okay, then 2003, I started working with the collection directly, and it's been a lot of work. Very little of it is actually done by me, I hasten to say, but lots of different students did, encoded all those catalog card data into a database, and lots of scanning was done, and continues to be done. So this is where we are now. And the next question is, what next? We hope to put it all online. We don't have it there yet, but we've been working toward that for several years, both asking for money that it hasn't happened, but also just preparing the materials themselves to be ready to go when we do manage to get a way to do that. And I will now I want to bring up I want to share another screen, which is the database that I've spoken of. I can't seem to get where I'm going though. Sorry about this. There we are. I'm going to resume share now. So I hope you can see this. It's very weird not being able to see what you're actually showing. This is the database. Can you see it well enough?
Yes, it looks
Okay.
good.
This is a funny little photo. There's some funny photos that Dixon had various interests, like photographing animals, and he loved children and puppies. So we have some of those here too. trap myself again. Anyway, in this database, which I will attempt to this is a searchable database, and I can look for anything you want. I think that sorry.
You have one request for porcupines, Ellen.
Oh, I wonder who that came from. Okay, I'm really sorry, but I'm on my new computer and it's not really very cooperative at the moment. So just talk amongst yourselves. So I wonder who asked that about the porcupines. I bet it was Sarah.
It was.
Okay.
Guilty.
Let me. Here, we have several photos of porcupines being harvested for their quills in 1908 at the Crow Reservation in Montana. This one even has dogs in it. Any other requests? As I say, he likes to have photos of children. So I'm going to look up another. Actually, what's Sarah's favorite? This is Sarah's favorite photo. It shows a little girl cuddling a puppy, playing with it, and you get the shadow of Joseph Dixon intruding into the photo. And this little child looks somewhat confused, as one might expect, just minding her own business, and this guy comes along and takes a photo. But her mother on the edge here seems fine with it. We've also got
Melody asked if you have any of hide scraping.
No, I already know I don't need to look because I don't have it. Sorry, Melody. Can also search by date. So in 1913, Dixon traveled around to a large number of reservations and towns and took photos as part of his so-called expedition of citizenship. He was looking for support among Native Americans for a bill in Congress that would give them citizenship if they wanted it. And there were, it's a very wide touring area all across the country. And he took lots of photos there. And they were sort of like come as you are photos. They weren't necessarily wearing.
So Ellen,
Yes.
Sally asked approximately how many photos are in the collection.
Oh, what a
and
great
how many
question.
different tribes?
There are, I think, about 70 different tribes, and there are about 8,000 photos.
Wow.
So Susan Applegate did a tremendous job in the 70s of putting these things into good form for keeping the knowledge as well as the photos. Any other questions?
Yeah.
I'm gonna look up something in particular.
Judy was wondering if you could talk about the World War I records
World
associated with.
War I, what an excellent question. After World War I in 1919, Dixon, and it was still part of his desire to allow Native Americans to have citizenship. Some did already, but not that many. So he went around and photographed soldiers who'd returned from the war, native soldiers. And as you can see here, this one's in New Jersey. He took a lot of photos at military settings, hospitals and camps on the East Coast. And this is perhaps our most famous photo altogether of the Choctaw telephone squad. This was a earlier version of Navajo code talkers, and people do call these guys code talkers, which is not correct. They weren't called that. They were called the telephone squad because they simply, one Choctaw person was on the battlefield front and another was at the back, and they could talk to each other in Choctaw, and the Germans couldn't figure out what they were saying. So this is a very famous photo. There are 3 versions of it.
And Christine was wondering if any of the photos are available online right now.
No, that's not entirely true. We have a small exhibit through IU Omeka, and we can send out that link, but we don't have them online. We, for a brief time, had about 1,000 of them online, and that was the result of a project that some students were doing. We want to see if we can put these online, and they did, but they didn't put a whole lot of information online, and it was only a temporary thing. So we've been, as I say, working on it for some time through various stages of the museum and different directors, and some of them told me, no, it's not a priority, and others said, why isn't it done? It's been a little hard to get the funding to do it, but as I say, we're ready now. We have a decent database in shape. We can export that into any system we want, and we've got the photographs scanned.
And then Allison was wondering if it would be possible to match the individuals in the photographs to those who may be recorded on the cylinder recordings made by Dixon.
Possibly, if he wrote those down. I mean, if he wrote both the names, I can certainly look them up. Oh, I should mention also, there are thousands of pages of documents, including for World War I, a whole set of about 2,500 questionnaires that Dixon sent out asking the veterans to talk about their experience in the war. Again, this was part of the part of him wanting to demonstrate to politicians in Washington that these folks had served their country and deserved citizenship. So on those, we have lots of names of people, and some of those also show up in the photos. But I hadn't thought of looking up cross-referencing with the cylinders, but I'm sure it's possible.
Yeah. Allison said that they do have some names in their catalog records, and she would love to do a collaboration effort.
That would be fabulous.
Yeah. So maybe reach out to Ellen, send her an email, Allison. And Melody asked if there has been any engagement with descendant communities that are represented in the photographs.
Oh yeah, that's one thing we've been doing for decades. It's a little, I haven't had, since I've been here, I haven't had the resources to simply write to everybody that we have photos of and say, I mean, the tribes, and say, we have these photos. But a lot of them write to me and say, do you have photos of my tribe? And, or more especially, do you have photos of so-and-so? He was my great grandfather. And what we do is, yeah, when we do have those things, that the descendants get free copies. They used to get prints, but now they get digital images if that's what they prefer. And then they can make any number of their own prints if they wish to. And we've also done that with tribes. We don't usually do that totally for free, but we have a very reduced price so that they can, afford to get all of them from their tribe, like maybe 50 photos.
Great. Well, that's great, Ellen. And I think we're about at our time. We might be a little bit over, but this was wonderful. I learned a lot, and I think everyone had a really great time. So thank you.
Thank you, guys. It was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me know if you need to know more about any of this.
Yeah. Ellen's email
Thank
is
you.
on the website, and we're going to do another Coffee and Curator lecture next month. So keep your eyes out for that.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting.
You bet. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much.